The quiet of the studio was absolute. Daniel lived high above the city's noise, in a space defined by high vaulted ceilings and vast empty walls. A room designed for creation, but which often felt like a cage. He was meticulous, reclusive, and obsessed with the human form. Tonight, he was working on a commission, a portrait of a serene woman, intended to capture a look of quiet, internal joy. He held the brush steady, his concentration total. The canvas glowed under the warm directional lights. He was detailing the woman's mouth, preparing to execute the subtle curve that would suggest a gentle, contented smile. The silence broke not with sound, but with motion. His hand twitched. It was a sharp, involuntary jump that pulled the fine sable brush laterally across the canvas, destroying the delicate curve he intended. Daniel cursed softly, dabbing the excess paint with a rag. He closed his eyes, took a deep breath, and prepared to correct the line. Exhaustion, he told himself. Too much caffeine. He reopened his eyes and focused. But when he brought the brush back to the canvas, the twitch returned, faster and more aggressive. His fingers, ignoring the precise motor command from his brain, forced the brush into a new, terrifying trajectory. Instead of curving upward for a smile, the paint went down, pulling the edges of the mouth wide and angular. Daniel stared, horrified. His hand, the instrument of his precise will, had painted a screaming mouth. He tried to stop, pulling the brush away from the canvas, but his fingers refused to cooperate. They were locked tight around the wooden handle, rigid and cold, refusing to acknowledge the command to relax. His hand, heavy and unnatural, remained fixed in position, hovering over the canvas, its next movement already being planned without his consent. A cold dread seized him. This wasn't exhaustion. This was a theft of will. He leaned back, dragging his immobilized hand with him. He tried the simple, violent act of striking his wrist against the easel. The pain was sharp, but the fingers remained locked, the brush fixed. Then he felt it, the subtle, undeniable sensation of tension on his wrist. It wasn't muscle strain, it was a faint, external pressure, a cold, almost imperceptible tug that pulled his arm gently forward toward the painted portrait. It felt like a fine, invisible fishing line hooked to his wrist, patiently reeling him in. The painted scream on the canvas seemed to deepen, its agony reflecting the sudden, cold fear in Daniel's own eyes. He knew he was no longer alone in the quiet, high-ceilinged studio. Something unseen was now guiding his hand, forcing him to complete a painting he did not want to create. Daniel finally managed to pry the brush from his fingers hours later, but only after tearing a strip of skin from his thumb in the process. The scream remained on the canvas, a terrifying monument to his compromised will. He secured the studio, locking the heavy doors, trying to convince himself that intense focus had simply induced muscle spasm. He fell into bed, seeking the oblivion of sleep. He awoke abruptly, not to sound, but to motion. The digital clock glowed 3 a.m. Daniel was standing upright in the center of his dark bedroom. He hadn't consciously decided to move. His body had been moved. He was rigid, cold, and utterly terrifyingly aware that he was a passenger in his own physical form. He tried to scream, to fall, to collapse, but his vocal cords were seized, his legs locked. He was forced into a stiff, unnatural march out of the bedroom and into the vast, dark kitchen. His movements were jerky, puppet-like, driven by a force external to his consciousness. The terror was absolute. He could feel his own panic building, the tears streaming silently down his cheeks, yet his face was betraying him. His muscles were seized in a horrifying mimicry of joy. A wide, stretching, unnatural grin fixed and cold upon his face. He was crying and smiling simultaneously. His right hand, the same hand that painted the scream, was forced outward. His fingers wrapped around a heavy glass bottle of cooking oil resting on the counter. The movement was slow, deliberate, and terrifyingly precise. Stop it! Please, stop it! Daniel silently pleaded, the sounds trapped uselessly behind his rigid jaw. The hand raised the bottle. He watched, horrified, as his own arm swung back and slammed the heavy glass bottle against the side of his own head.
The impact was sharp and sickening. The glass shattered, showering the kitchen with oil and debris. White-hot pain exploded behind his eyes, and blood immediately warmed the side of his face. He collapsed to his knees, his own scream of agony muffled and trapped, while the terrifying grin remained fixed. He lay there, shaking, injured and completely helpless. He realized the sensation on his limbs. It wasn't just magnetic pulling. He felt a network of thin, sharp, invisible strings hooked into his joints, his elbows, his shoulders, his knees. They were constantly vibrating with malicious energy, jerking him around the room like a marionette controlled by a cruel, unseen puppeteer. The invisible strings pulled his bleeding head up to face the dark, high ceiling. The cold, unseen force was watching him, punishing him, and forcing him to inflict pain upon himself for its silent, dark amusement. He was a prisoner in his own skin, and the show had just begun. The first weak light of morning brought no relief. Daniel spent the remaining hours in agony, huddled in the wreckage of his kitchen, fighting every twitch and spasm that tried to drag him back into the cruel mechanical dance. His head throbbed violently, his cheek was sticky with dried blood, and his limbs ached from fighting the invisible strings. He used heavy electrical cable and rope to tie himself securely to his stout wooden studio chair. He bound his wrists, ankles, and chest, determined to deny the unseen force control over his body. His first conscious action was a desperate call. He didn't call the police. He called a man of faith. Father Thomas arrived 40 minutes later, a tired, compassionate man whose face showed immediate alarm at the sight of the barricaded chair, the blood, and the smashed kitchen. "Daniel, my son, what madness is this?" the father asked, his voice soft but firm. Daniel struggled against the ropes. His hands, though tied, still twitched violently, pulling at the rough cables. He kept his face bowed, unable to hide the fixed, terrifying grin that persisted even through the immense pain. "Father, I can't control my body. Something is moving me. I smashed my own head. I tried to paint a scream. I am not myself." Father Thomas knelt beside the chair, his eyes fixed not on the blood, but on the unnaturally sharp, isolated twitches pulling Daniel's limbs against the binding. He saw the cold, mechanical terror in the artist's eyes. "Tell me everything, Daniel. This is not mere physical affliction. When did this begin? What sin weighs on your soul?" Daniel closed his eyes, the guilt, an old, cold weight he had carried for decades, finally surfacing under the pressure of the attack. "My sister," Daniel whispered, the memory flooding him with shame. "When I was 10, she had this doll, antique, porcelain, her most prized possession. I was jealous of the attention she gave it." He paused, taking a shuddering breath. "I hated that doll. I crept out one night, took it from her room, and carried it into the woods. I built a small fire, and I burned it." The memory was visceral, immediate. He recalled the horrifying, sickening smell of the old porcelain and painted silk melting in the heat. He remembered the doll's painted face, perfect and serene, slowly warping, contorting, the painted smile stretching into a horrifying, silent grimace. He remembered standing over the fire, watching the melting face look at him, accusing him, as the plastic eyes bubbled and popped. "I watched it melt, Father," Daniel confessed, tears finally blurring the terrible grin on his face. "I destroyed the things she loved. I felt free then. But now I think it's the punishment. I think the doll came back. It's making it its puppet."
Father Thomas listened to Daniel's painful confession, the weight of the childhood sin settling heavily in the silent studio. He looked at the shattered kitchen, the fixed, terrifying grin, and the unnaturally twitching limbs. He knew this was not merely guilt. It was spiritual possession, driven by retribution. The priest stood and retrieved his worn leather satchel. He produced a small silver vial of holy water and a heavy wooden crucifix. He stood over the bound man, his face grim with professional determination. "If the sin is the anchor, Daniel, then God's grace must break the chain," Father Thomas murmured, beginning the initial prayers in steady Latin, his voice cutting cleanly through the studio's oppressive quiet. As the father's prayers intensified, the twitches in Daniel's limbs became convulsions, pulling violently against the restraints. The grin on his face stretched wider, becoming a grotesque rictus of pure, terrified joy. Father Thomas finished the prayer and extended his hand. He flicked the holy water onto Daniel's forehead. The effect was immediate and shocking. The spot where the water landed instantly smoked, leaving a faint, sickening sizzle in the air. Daniel's entire body went rigid. The ropes holding him, thick electrical cable and heavy rope, snapped with a loud, simultaneous crack, 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 tearing against the wood of the chair. Daniel's body was instantly released, but he did not fall or move naturally. He rose stiffly, vertically, heels off the ground, suspended by the immense renewed tension of the invisible strings. He floated a half-inch above the wooden floor, swaying slightly, a terrifying puppet held taut in the air. Father Thomas recoiled, crossing himself rapidly, his prayers momentarily forgotten. The silence that followed was broken by a new sound emanating from Daniel's throat. It was not Daniel's voice, nor was it the deep masculine voice of a demon. It was a high-pitched, thin, utterly chilling giggle, a sound that was synthetic, brittle, and sounded exactly like shattering porcelain. The giggle escalated into words, spoken with the chilling, innocent cadence of a small girl, yet laced with ancient malice. The voice was cold, high, and utterly unnatural. "You think water helps, Father? He used fire. He used fire to break me into pieces." The entity, speaking through Daniel's rigid body, laughed again, the brittle plastic sound echoing off the high ceiling. Daniel's own eyes were wide with trapped horror, watching his body's betrayal. The voice addressed the priest directly, its tone mocking and triumphant. "You think water helps, Father? He used fire. He used fire to break me into pieces. I will break him. I will break his mind, his body, and his spirit. He will be my puppet forever." The floating, rigid body of Daniel swung violently toward the terrified priest, propelled by the unseen strings. The attack had begun. Father Thomas, despite his fear, raised the crucifix as the unnaturally suspended body moved toward him. The porcelain giggle intensified. The priest knew the fight was not against Daniel, but for the soul trapped within. The entity did not strike the priest immediately. Instead, it used Daniel's body as a horrifying demonstration of its absolute, chilling control. Daniel let out a muffled, agonizing shriek, a pure sound of pain trapped beneath the fixed, terrifying smile, as his body began to move in ways no human body should. The torture began with his neck. Daniel's head slowly began to turn, his chin twisting past his shoulder with deliberate, agonizing slowness. Then, sickeningly, it kept turning. The sound of his vertebrae grinding and snapping was distinct, wet, and utterly horrifying, audible over the heavy panting of the priest. The turning was slow, inexorable, and completely forced against the resistance of muscle and tendon. The entity twisted his head a full 180 degrees, until Daniel's face, contorted in a mask of silent, absolute pain, was staring directly over his own shoulder, backward at the horrified priest. His terror was visible in his eyes, now fixed wide and upward, watching the room from a completely impossible angle. The entity then targeted his limbs. Daniel's knees abruptly bent the wrong way, not forward, but backward, snapping his legs into the sharp, thin pose of a broken bird's legs. The movement was accompanied by a wet, tearing sound of ligaments ripping and kneecaps shifting violently out of place. His elbows bent inward toward his chest, his arms drawn into sharp, broken angles above his head. Daniel was being physically twisted into impossible, doll-like shapes, his living flesh and bone brutally rearranged into the deformed geometry of the porcelain doll he had destroyed decades ago. He was the broken doll, and the unseen strings were pulling every joint beyond its natural limit. Through the silent agony, a single hoarse word finally tore past his twisted vocal cords, aimed not at the priest, but at the unseen tormentor. "Die! Please, let me die!" The entity's high-pitched, childish giggle returned, cold and cruel. "No! You must stay and see the pieces, Daniel! You must feel every break! I am not done creating my art!" The unseen strings tightened further, his spine arched backward into a terrifying, impossible C-curve, lifting his head, now facing backward, further off the floor. Blood began to seep slowly from the corners of his eyes and mouth, testament to the extreme, agonizing internal pressure. He was a prisoner of bone and spite, his consciousness trapped and forced to witness the ultimate violation of his own physical form. The horror was complete. The punishment was perfectly tailored to the crime. The intense physical agony of the twisting continued. Daniel's spine was bent into a horrifying curve, his limbs drawn into sharp, impossible angles. He was a captive of bone and malicious spite. Father Thomas, witnessing the sheer, stomach-churning horror, did not waver. He dropped the useless crucifix and grabbed his silver vial of holy water. He ignored the blood and the snapping joints, focusing his entire will on the spiritual battle. He continued his prayers, his voice rising, strong and clear, battling the cruel, high-pitched giggles of the entity. The water flicked onto Daniel's convulsing body. The searing sizzle returned, more aggressive this time, and the holy water evaporated instantly in a puff of acrid steam. The entity, driven by the pure, focused counterforce of faith, erupted in raw, blinding rage. The pressure on Daniel's body ceased momentarily, only to focus entirely on his face. Daniel's jaw stretched outward, his mouth opening impossibly wide, his face tearing at the corners, defying the limits of his skull. The scream Adam had painted on the canvas was now violently realized. But no sound of pain emerged. Instead, a terrifying, thick swarm of insects poured out of his gaping, unhinged mouth. It wasn't a trickle, it was a flood. Hundreds of black beetles, hard-shelled and frantically crawling, and small, dark-winged moths streamed out of Daniel's throat, immediately filling the air and landing heavily on the walls and furniture. The torrent of decay spilled onto the floor, quickly covering the rugs and mixing with the pooling blood. The grotesque swarm poured over Father Thomas. The insects crawled into his hair, his collar, and covered his hands, a chilling, crawling assault designed to break his resolve through sheer revulsion. The smell intensified horribly, a concentrated stench of burnt plastic and old hair, the exact odor of the melted porcelain doll. The high-pitched, childish voice of the entity returned, now seeming to emanate not from Daniel's mouth, but from the collective chittering, crawling mass of insects themselves, a collective, suffocating sound. "I am not a demon, old man. I am only the memory of what he burned. I am the pieces he threw away. I am the plastic tears he melted." The voice mocked the priest's attempts at faith. "Your God didn't save me from the fire, so your prayers cannot save him from the pieces. He thought he could erase me. He thought he could bury the memory. But I have always been here, in the ashes, in the silent places."
The swarm surged, pressing in on the priest, covering his face and obscuring his vision. The sheer, overwhelming reality of the physical attack, the insects, the stench, the cracking bone, and the terrifying cold voice threatened to suffocate the final shred of hope. The swarm of beetles and moths pulsed, delivering the chilling message of the burned memory. Father Thomas fought the suffocating wave of insects, shielding his face, his prayers reduced to desperate, gasping whispers. The entity, having established its identity and power, turned its focused cruelty back to Daniel. The physical torture resumed, aimed at the root of his being, his ability to create. The invisible strings attached to Daniel's broken body tightened, forcing his mangled form to become rigid again. His head, still twisted backward, was slowly pulled upright. The doll's voice, high and thin, announced its final, devastating retribution. "He loved these hands. These are the hands that burned me. These are the hands that made the beautiful lies on the canvas." The voice resonated with bitter jealousy. "Now they belong to the ashes." The strings pulled Daniel's arms upward, lifting them into the air. Daniel let out a desperate, muffled sob of pure understanding. He knew what was coming. The torture was slow, precise, and agonizingly deliberate. The unseen force seized the fingers of his left hand. With a dry, sickening snap, the first knuckle broke, bent backward at an impossible angle. Daniel's eyes, trapped in his twisted face, bulged in silent agony. The process repeated. Snap, the second knuckle. Crack, the third. One by one, with chilling, methodical cruelty, the invisible strings pulled Daniel's fingers backward, crushing the delicate bones. The sound of the brittle bones snapping was sharp, distinct, and horrifyingly amplified in the sudden lull of the insect swarm. Daniel was screaming, but the sound was trapped, a raw internal explosion of pain and loss. His hands, the instruments of his artistic will, the true expression of his soul, were being systematically destroyed. The process continued on his right hand, the most vital tool of his identity, until both hands were mangled, useless messes of bone and torn flesh, hanging limp and broken from his wrists. The entity wasn't finished. It allowed the broken hands to drop. With a jerk, the invisible strings pulled Daniel toward the remnants of his shattered kitchen. His head was forced downward. The entity guided his ruined right hand to the floor, where blood from the glass injury and the fresh trauma was pooling near the broken electrical cables. The mangled fingers, against the will of his screaming mind, were forced to grasp a discarded paintbrush, the very brush that had painted the initial scream. The high, chilling giggle returned. "You must finish the portrait, Daniel, but you will use my color." The invisible strings pulled the broken hand down. The raw, shredded fingers gripped the brush and dipped it not into the rich oils of his palette, but into the dark, viscous pool of his own blood on the floor. He was being forced to use his own suffering as the final medium. The memory was painting itself onto the canvas of his life. The invisible strings guided Daniel's broken hand, dipping the paintbrush into the pool of his own blood. The entity was ready to complete its final terrible piece of art. Father Thomas, still struggling against the swarm of insects and the raw terror, attempted one last desperate act of intercession. He lunged forward, throwing the last drops of holy water from his vial onto the rigid body of Daniel.
The entity shrieked, a high, deafening sound of pure spiritual rejection, and violently released the control over Daniel's body. Simultaneously, an immense, unseen kinetic force slammed into Father Thomas. The priest was hurled across the studio, his body hitting the far wall with a heavy, sickening impact. He collapsed instantly, his vision blurring into immediate unconsciousness. The studio fell into absolute silence. The high, chilling giggle of the entity was gone. The buzzing of the insects ceased. Father Thomas woke slowly. His head was throbbing, and the studio lights, which had been turned on by the automatic timer, cast a cold, sterile light across the scene of carnage. The time was 7:15 a.m. He pushed himself upright, his gaze sweeping the wrecked studio. The floor was covered in shattered porcelain, dried blood, and the remnants of the strange black ash and insect swarm. Daniel was slumped against the wall, near the shattered chair. His body was twisted and unnatural, his limbs horribly tangled beneath him, like a discarded marionette whose strings had been cut all at once. His head was still turned backward, resting against his shoulder blade. He was utterly still. Father Thomas crawled toward the body, checking for a pulse that he knew he wouldn't find. Daniel was cold, lifeless, a silent testament to the devastating power of retribution. The true cause of death was not the injuries, but the catastrophic strain of the forced, impossible movements. The priest's gaze moved from the corpse to the easel. There, bathed in the cold morning light, was the completed portrait. The original serene face was gone. In its place, painted meticulously with thick, dark blood, was a perfect, terrifying image of the burnt doll. The painted porcelain face was warped and melted, the eyes wide and accusing, the mouth stretched into the final, silent scream that Daniel had tried so desperately to avoid painting. The final, brutal strokes were undeniable. The entity had finished its art, using the hand that had sinned and the blood that was owed. Father Thomas crossed himself, tears of profound sadness and terror streaming down his face. The studio was a tomb, sealed not by metal, but by a memory made manifest. The police and paramedics would arrive soon, finding only the evidence of a psychotic break and a tragic, unexplainable death. But Father Thomas knew the truth. Some childhood sins leave a permanent spiritual wound. Daniel thought he was fighting a ghost, but he was fighting the piece of his own soul he had tried to burn away. The narrator's voice shifts, becoming low and reflective. We carry the burdens of our past in the quiet, empty spaces of our lives. You can bury the evidence, but the deepest parts of your memory never forget the moment you chose cruelty. And sometimes the thing you destroyed comes back to claim the pieces. Some toys should never be broken. Tell me in the comments, what is the one childhood object you were terrified of? If you want to hear the next case file, subscribe and turn on notifications.